Hey everyone, just a quick update about what's going on. What you're seeing today on the Senate floor is some action to save net neutrality, pushed primarily by Senator Markey and supported by an outside coalition of groups like Demand Progress, Fight for the Future, and others. This is a red alert net neutrality action that's happening all over the internet today and on the Senate floor. What's happened so far is that Senator Markey has pushed a resolution onto the Senate floor and got 52 votes for a motion to proceed to consider SJ Res 52 in the Senate, which is essentially a resolution of congressional disapproval, which relates to the FCC's recent moves to gut net neutrality. Now, just as background, if you don't know what net neutrality is, it's the very basic principle that there shouldn't be the ability to throttle content or favor certain content for pay, that the internet should remain a level playing field so that big corporations and greedy ISPs can't essentially turn the internet into a crappy caricature of itself that mimics the way cable packages are sold right now. These ISPs swear they would never do that, but they just want the ability to do that. And no one should trust that at all. We're at a quorum call right now. What's happening right now is there's up to 10 hours of debate, but that definitely won't happen. By about 3 o'clock, we expect a vote on this. So if you've got a moment, right now is your last chance for the foreseeable future to make a real impact and move the ball forward on net neutrality. You can go to battleforthenet.com and you'll be able to find your elected officials that have a vote on this measure and contact them and tell them that you support SJ Res 52 and you expect your representatives to stand up for net neutrality as defined by this measure. One of the real problems in this debate is that the Republicans and the backers of gutting net neutrality are trying to appropriate the language of net neutrality and say they're for it, but they mean that they want the corporations to be able to do whatever they feel like on the internet. The simple fact is that the internet is a public good that was created through intense federal investment. The protocol that makes the internet work was developed from research done under a federal grant, and any amount of federal subsidies have gone into building the broadband backbone and infrastructure that we have in this country for the internet. These corporations take billions of dollars in federal subsidies and tax breaks. Many of them pay very little, if any, corporate taxes because they're great at hiding their money. And they expect us to now just give them the internet to turn it into the disaster that cable packages have become. And, you know, people leaving the cable subscribership and moving onto the internet for resources like Netflix or other online content streaming resources is one of the things that's promoting this from the corporate side. They see that people don't want to pay for these crappy packages and they're tired of the crappy service and they want to have more control over what they're paying for, and they're moving to the internet for that. But it's also a way that these corporations who aren't necessarily ISPs can squeeze to death small businesses that are getting started on the internet. It's important for rural communities as well. It's important for people who want to have access to markets that they wouldn't have locally. It's really important for people who want to be able to participate fully in our political discussions, who want to be able to have some sort of level playing field against groups like the Koch brothers and other huge corporatists that are trying to, continually consolidate media and prevent real debate from happening in this country. And so it's really important. Again, you can find the URL in the section below me here on the feed. It's battleforthenet.com. Please tweet about it. Please post it on your Facebook, and please pick up the phone and call your elected officials. Even if you think they're not going to agree with you, they really need to hear your voice, because maybe they won't vote yes, but maybe they won't vote no either. And that's a win too. So please take to the internet, take to the phones. It's time to stand up for net neutrality. We can stop what Trump and Ajit Pai are doing to the internet, but we need Congress to be on board. So today's when the vote's happening in the Senate. We can't get to the next step in the fight unless we pass this now. So I'm going to go back to the live stream for a while, but I'll be coming back in periodically to update you and to remind folks what's going on today. But please go to battleforthenet.com and take this opportunity to stand up for a free and open internet. So we'll just go back to the Senate live stream for a little while now.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. In December, the FCC made a colossal mistake by rolling back net neutrality protections. And today, the Senate has an opportunity to begin the process of righting that wrong with an up or down vote to overturn the FCC's repeal and to restore the free and open internet. Now, this is a big deal. We just had a vote with all Democrats and independents and 3 Republicans, and we have another vote at around 3 o'clock. If we fail, the FCC will end net neutrality protections in early June. And if we succeed, then this fight will go on to the next step in the House of Representatives. Mr. President, this vote is a no-brainer. Net neutrality is one of those most popular issues that the Senate will consider this year. There is no other issue that polls so decisively on one side. A survey by the University of Maryland found that 83% of people are in favor of net neutrality, and that includes 75% of Republicans, 89% of Democrats, and 86% of independents. And when you think about people's experience with their ISP, it makes perfect sense. People are already frustrated with the limited competitive options for the providers that they have. And then once they sign up for service, they find that there are hidden fees. They have to pay for the installation. They have to wait for the installation. They have to rent the cable box. Their bill suddenly goes up within a year of service, finding out that they were only engaged in a promotional offer. In other words, many people don't like their internet service providers. They like the internet, but they don't like the lack of choice and all the hassle and expense that comes with getting on the internet. And so if you ask people if we should get rid of the rules that actually give consumers control over their internet access, if we should give broadband companies even more power over our lives, they say no. Providers promise to be good to consumers. And in fact, many of them have said that they don't need the FCC to maintain a free and open internet because they are already officially committed to the idea. But without net neutrality, there is nothing in the law that prevents companies from treating content or websites differently. In fact, many of these publicly traded companies, once the dust settles, once the politics wanes of this net neutrality issue, they will be talking to their chief financial officers, their boards of directors will be asking, why are you not maximizing revenue? Why are you not charging consumers more when you can? And if the answer is, in the process of trying to prevent a piece of legislation from passing, we made a promise, the board of directors will say, well, change your mind. And the only thing that can stop a corporation who provides broadband services to consumers from doing all the wrong things is a law. It is not a promise, it is a law. And so the question for the Senate is very simple. Whose side are you on? Are you for the consumers who are asking us to protect the internet, or are you with the telecommunications companies? And I want to be really clear here. There is no constituency on the other side of this other than the telecommunications companies. You don't go to a town hall meeting and see this thing evenly split. Right? When we were debating the Iran deal or the Affordable Care Act or an infrastructure bill or the tax bill, there are, even in a deep blue state like Hawaii or a deep red state like some of my colleagues, there's always people on both sides of this issue. I have not met one human being in Hawaii who's against net neutrality. And I challenge anybody out there to find someone who's against net neutrality. The only constituency for this is the people who would benefit from what the FCC already did. Some are pointing to a bill in the House that would take care of a few of the problems that come with getting rid of net neutrality, but when you dig a little deeper, it's clear that this is not a compromise. It doesn't offer close to the protection that net neutrality gives consumers and small businesses. In fact, it gives these ISPs the ability to charge small businesses and consumers more money for different types of content, and that's the crux of the issue. Again, go ask a consumer, a small business owner, and they will tell you they are already frustrated with internet providers, and they expect Congress to do the right thing and look out for their interests. The issue is incredibly important to young people. They've grown up on the internet. It's part of their lives, and they do not want Congress to stand by and do nothing as this FCC allows internet providers to change the way we access the internet. It's clear to me that net neutrality is popular among everyone: older people, young people, small business owners, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, red states and blue states. It's also clear that the benefit to them does not come close to the benefit to the ISPs does not come close to outweighing the benefits that students, businesses, schools, families, and others will get from a free and open internet. With this vote, every member of the Senate will be on the record for or against net neutrality. I hope every member will choose to vote the way that nearly all of America wants us to and restore net neutrality. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I was in a conversation with a group of Oklahomans just last week. The issue of net neutrality came up in that conversation. A gentleman there who publishes content on the internet said he was very concerned about net neutrality and wanted to make sure that the content that he had, he could continue to publish, and he would not have to go to every single ISP, internet service provider, across the country and negotiate a deal with them. And that's what happens with net neutrality. And I said, that's very interesting. Has that happened to you? Have you faced that? And he said, no, but I'm afraid I might. Here's the problem we have with this conversation about net neutrality. For 20 years, the internet functioned under a very clear set of rules. The Federal Trade Commission had a set of rules for both content providers and for the fiber, the internet service providers. A clear set of rules. They couldn't violate anti-trade practices, they couldn't do monopolies, they couldn't violate the basic rules of commerce. There's a very clear set of rules. And then 2 years ago, the FCC. Now, the FTC is the one, the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC has been the one regulating the internet for 2 decades. The FCC decided they wanted to regulate not the content and the internet service providers, just the internet service providers. So the FCC, in an unprecedented ruling that had already gone to court multiple times and failed, grabbed the regulatory control from the FTC and said, we'll take the internet service providers and we'll manage them, and you keep the content folks. That's the fight that we're in right now. It's the funniest thing to me to be in a conversation about net neutrality, because the implication is the internet will not be free if the government doesn't regulate it with this particular entity, the FCC. When I ask people, would it be okay if the government regulated with the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, most people say, well, that'd be fine too. Well, good, because that's the way it has been for 20 years. For 20 years, there's been one set of rules on the superhighway of the internet, the Federal Trade Commission. Here's what I'd like to say to people that are trying to listen in, trying to figure this out. Most of the arguments and the fights that have come about cost increases and about paid prioritization and about blocking and about people monitoring content hasn't been from the internet service providers, it's been from the content folks. You tell me, when you go to your news feed and whatever social media site you go to or whatever news site you go to, are there the paid commercials that come up first and then your friends that come up second? Probably most of the time. Are there certain bits of content that you pay more for? If you're on Facebook, you can put this out, but you'll reach more people if you pay for it? Yes. But that's not net neutrality. The argument about net neutrality doesn't have anything to do with those content folks. It's about the internet service providers. So why do I bring this up? Here's what's happened. Over the past 2 years, America has been drawn into a fight between two sets of mega companies. Google and Facebook and Netflix are at war with AT&T and Comcast and all the major internet service providers. You've got the content folks on the web fighting with the internet service providers that actually provide the fiber to connect the content. They're fighting over their business. And the way the content providers have worded it is they've said, we want the internet to be neutral. We don't want to have customers pay more for certain content, and we don't want the internet service providers to charge more based on that content. While at the whole time, the content folks are charging people for the type of content. They're literally arguing and saying, we don't want them to do what we do every single day. What Google does every day, what Facebook does every day. In fact, they fight about, we don't want to filter out content when, we don't want internet service providers to filter out content when of late, Facebook seems to put out every week a new release about how they're filtering content from places that they don't like. Here's what we really want: a fair, flat playing field for everyone. That everyone that wants to do free speech can do free speech on the internet. That if you want to start a new business, you can put up a website on the internet, and you don't have to worry about somebody filtering you out. This is not China, a place where they'll filter out and decide whether you can put your content out. This is the United States of America. And everybody wants their content to be able to go out and to be fair and to not have someone judge it. That's what we want with an open internet. By the way, that's what you have if the Federal Trade Commission goes back to regulating as they have for 20 years. I ask a simple question. Was the internet open and fair for content in 2015? I believe it was. If you check your history books from 3 years ago, I think you'll find that the internet was open in 2015. Facebook was out there, Netflix was out there, YouTube was out there. It was open in 2015. We're not talking about any set of rules different than how the internet operated in 2015. But what we don't want to have is two different sets of rules, where this set of companies, the Googles and Facebooks and Netflix, gets to tell a different set of companies, the fiber, how they do their business. Neither do we want the fiber companies telling the content folks how to run their business. Let them compete. And a lot of people say, well, there's only a few internet service providers that are out there. Well, in the United States, there are 4,500 internet service providers that are out there. Yes, there are some big ones, but there are a lot of small ones. And if the big ones misbehave, guess what happens? Competition will beat them down. And those small companies will beat them because the big companies get out of line. It's the way America works and the way competition works when you keep it fair and open. It's a misnomer to talk about net neutrality as if it's not neutral right now. There are a lot of fears and a lot of innuendos. There's a lot of accusations of what ifs, and maybe they'll come out, and I'm afraid the boogeyman's going to come and take over the internet. But really what's happening is two giant sets of companies are competing and asking the government to jump in the middle. And the Googles and Facebooks and Netflix are asking this government to go give restrictions to the internet service providers that they are not willing to actually have themselves. Why don't we just do this? Let everybody compete and not try to have the government in between. Can we have net neutrality where we don't have blocking of content, where we have fair trade rules, where we make sure everybody gets access to the internet? Yes. We can have that when the Federal Trade Commission actually oversees those rules, as they have for 2 decades. There's a lot of hyperbole in this. I wish there were just more facts coming to the table at the same time the hyperbole was coming out. The simplest conversation that I can have is actually a conversation I had with a mayor not long ago. We were talking through the complexity of this and about fiber networks and about broadband and capabilities and speeds and all these things, and he said, hold on, I'm a mayor. Can we talk about water pipes for a minute? And I said, sure. He said, so what you're telling me is there's lots of water going in the water pipe and lots of people that are using that water, and we've got to find a fair way to be able to get all that water out because there's more water trying to get into that pipe than we can actually get out on the other end, and it's backing up. And I said, yes, sir, that's exactly what I'm saying. But it's zeros and ones running through a piece of fiber not water running through a pipe. He said, I can get that. Let's just keep it fair so that every person that wants to get access to it can get access to it, and we're not discriminating on the water coming through the pipe. It's pretty easy. We can do that right now with the Federal Trade Commission. Tomorrow, I'm chairing a hearing in the subcommittee that I lead in appropriations, and we'll have the chairman of the FCC and the chairman of the FTC sit down for a 2-hour conversation, and I'm sure much of it will be on this issue of net neutrality. My encouragement is for people to actually listen in to get the facts about net neutrality, not the emotion, and not what the Googles and Facebooks and Netflix are telling you what to think because they're competing against the other guys. Come and get the real facts. We'll lay the facts on the table. And if there's an area that needs to be handled with new regulations, I'd be glad to be able to engage. But quite frankly, I think the internet needs the lightest touch possible. I don't see a reason why the federal government should get into the business of free speech and telling people what they can and can't say. Let's keep the internet open and free and fair and not block content. But let's also not try to jump between two sets of mega companies and pick winners and losers at the same time. Let's keep it open and let's stay out of the business of telling business how to run their business. With that, Mr. President, I yield back. The absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Okay, I just want to take a quick second to address something that the last Republican just said on the floor here. We're at a quorum call right now. The Republicans keep trying to kill consideration of this resolution by trying to note the absence of a quorum. So hopefully people who are fighting for net neutrality are on the ball and they will get people in the chamber in a consistent way and make sure that that procedural move doesn't kill this. But, you know, at the close of the last senator's remarks, this is a gentleman that opposes this measure for net neutrality. He said, it's not our job as the Senate or as Congress to get in the way of two big mega corporations and how they run their business. And if that's what he thinks about the powers of Congress, I want to know what he thinks Congress's job is. I mean, we have a society right now being totally dominated by corporate power. And this idea that the government is supposed to be a party that sits on the sidelines while mega corporations just decide what their own operating rules are going to be on systems that the federal government and the taxpayer and the wealth of this nation has made serious investments in. I don't know why he thinks we ought to have a Congress at all. And I honestly, that is really the point here. The point that the Republicans are trying to push under the Trump administration is a smash and grab on the Treasury and a destruction of any regulatory framework that prevents corporations from totally robbing democracy from people in the workplace, online, and at the ballot box. So I hope that folks won't fall for this kind of double talk on net neutrality. These folks on the Republican side who do not support net neutrality as it's commonly understood are trying to appropriate the language of neutrality, but what they're actually trying to say is we should just let corporations decide their own rules and take the investments that we've made as the public and do what they will with them. And that's not an appropriate perspective for someone who wants to be an elected official, from my perspective. And that's not the job in a democracy of a legislative body. Net neutrality is really important because it makes sure that these giant media corporations and ISPs like Verizon or AT&T don't get to decide what you do and don't get to see. From my perspective as a recent political candidate, can you imagine the impact that throttling the speed of a video would have on whether or not you watched a candidate's videos, or whether you watched an issue campaign's videos when they're trying to stand up for a local community against a big corporate power like Verizon or AT&T, what effect it would have if those companies could just choke off internet access to the content being produced. That's what's on the line here. And next month, if net neutrality isn't enforced by an act of Congress, then the FCC will be able to completely destroy that neutrality. So make sure that while we still have time to make these decisions, you go to battleforthenet.com and contact your elected officials. We only have a few hours before we expect to vote on this. Probably in about an hour and a half they're going to vote, sometime around 3 o'clock or 2 or 3 Central Time. And I'm hoping that everybody that sees this will pile onto the phones, share the messages about the need to contact your elected officials, and let's snatch victory from the jaws of defeat here on net neutrality. So I'm going to go back to the main feed for a minute, but just please take this lull as an opportunity to contact your senators and let them know that you support real net neutrality as it's embodied in SJ Res 52, and that you won't accept the double talk from the other side on net neutrality.
President,
The Assistant Democratic Leader.
as consent, the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today before the Senate is the question of whether we will continue to have a free and open access to the internet in the United States of America. Every day, millions of Americans log on. They rely on the internet to help their child with his or her homework assignment, help a father to video call his mother, who may live 3 states away, help a small businesswoman to make a sale to a customer halfway across the world. And currently, the people who use the internet in the United States, and others like them, are free to enjoy the internet as they wish. When you log on this morning, you have the same access to the internet as every other American. There's no fear that some internet provider is going to step in and say, wait a minute, we're going to slow down your service until you pay us more money, or limit your access to certain apps and information based on whether you pay an additional fee. What a contrast that is to things like cable television. What package did you buy? How many channels are in there? How much access do you have? Are you going to pay the bill again next month? It's quite a bit different, isn't it, than our access to the internet. Well, currently, users around the country are enjoying a free access to an open and neutral internet. But that's all about to change. It's about to change because this new president and his new head of the Federal Communications Commission believes that our access to the internet should be for sale. In fact, this administration thinks everything ought to be for sale. Public lands, our privacy, and in this case, our pathway to information, unfettered pathway to information. So thanks to the leadership of Ed Markey of Massachusetts and many of my colleagues, we come today to discuss this fundamental issue. This is a rare day in the United States Senate. We're actually discussing an issue of substance on the floor. I welcome the visitors for this historic moment. But we are preparing to vote tomorrow on whether or not the decision of the Trump administration's Federal Communications Commission, which ends net neutrality, is going to succeed or fail. Luckily, we were joined by at least one Republican, I didn't look at the final roll call, to move us forward in this debate. All the Democrats and at least one Republican, and we prevailed. Tomorrow, we hope to do the same, and we hope it'll be done on a bipartisan basis as well. Follow this debate because my guess is it's going to impact you and your life. The Trump administration and the Federal Communications Commission, if they have their way, are going to change our access to the internet. Every single family, every single business, every single doctor, the list goes on. In December, they voted, the FCC, to put the needs of companies ahead of consumers and to undo net neutrality in the United States. This great party on the other side of the aisle that talks about freedom, we want Americans to have freedom, want to take away our freedom for access to the internet. Why? So somebody can buy parts of it and sell them back to us. Under their new plan, the FCC would allow companies to freely block or slow down any American's access to websites based on the company's financial interest and would allow paid prioritization practices, which create internet fast lanes and slow lanes based on who can afford to pay more for the service. What a change from what we have today. Everyone has a favorite website they visit every day. I race in here in the morning and get back to the newspapers in Illinois, for example, to see what's going on in my home state. Well, what if one day you typed in the address of that newspaper and nothing popped up? Or you were able to visit it, but it took twice as long to download it. Remember those days when you used to deal with dial-up? Some of the young people in the chamber are probably scratching their head. What is dial-up all about? Well, those days did exist, and it was a much different world of the internet, which we could return to because of this FCC decision. This could be the reality under the Trump administration's Federal Communications Commission. For internet providers, this means they could discriminate against specific content on the internet and be free to do so in the name of competition. For consumers, it means less service, higher cost. And for entrepreneurs and small businesses, there's also a risk. I had a meeting this morning with the realtors of Illinois. There were about 20 of them gathered in a hallway. I was in a committee hearing. And they said, the first item on our agenda is net neutrality. I said, realtors, net neutrality? Explain. Well, people are now looking over their homes on the internet. Prospective purchases of homes do video tours of all of these different homes. We want our customers to have access to the internet so they can go shopping for their next home. We think it's good for American business. So do I, but not the Federal Communications Commission. They disagree. The internet has given the businesses not only access to customers, but a global reach and ability to compete with companies large and small. Success isn't determined on how rich your business is, it's how good your product is. If our country wants to grow its economy and continue to lead the world in innovation, we cannot allow the internet to become a place where businesses impose a pay-to-play scenario. I can't understand how the other party, this party of individualism and freedom, wants to take this freedom away from the American people. If the FCC's harmful new plan is allowed to take effect, consumers, businesses, and hardworking families will be hurt. It's no wonder public support for net neutrality is overwhelming. America gets it. The Federal Communications Commission and the President may not, but America understands this. All over the country, students, teachers, businesses, individuals, families are all making their voices heard, and I encourage them to continue to do so. We need more Republicans to stand up for your freedom. We need more Republican senators to join us in what should be a strong bipartisan effort. The FCC has announced that its radical plan to end net neutrality will take effect next month, unless Congress stops it. We're starting today with this vote in the Senate. We'll finish it tomorrow, and then if we're successful, it goes across the rotunda to the House. If they do nothing, your right to the internet is going to be destroyed. Today, every senator will have the chance to tell their constituents exactly where they stood on this issue of personal freedom, whether content on the internet should be treated equally and consumer access be a matter of how much you can pay. I think the answer is obvious. So do the overwhelming majority of Americans. Would the Republican Party please join us in a bipartisan effort to stand up for something that Americans across the board support? I urge my colleagues to support the concept of net neutrality and the CRA resolution before the Senate. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Oregon.
I ask unanimous consent that my intern, Annabel Moreno Mendez, be allowed to have privileges of the floor for the balance of the day.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you. We have watched in 2017, last year, a series of battles related to the very fundamental vision of our Constitution, whether we're going to do the people's work or we're going to be a Senate run by the most powerful and privileged in America. Well, there's no question how that came out. It was the powerful and the privileged. Three major things happened in 2017. The first was a health bill designed to destroy health care for some 30 million Americans, thereby also affecting everybody else by rising the costs of health care and putting our rural health care clinics and our rural hospitals out of business. That was a bill for the powerful and the privileged and against the people. And then we had the tax bill, a bill that borrows $1.5 trillion from the next generation. Our pages on the floor here on the next generation. We gave the bill to them and then gave the proceeds to the very richest Americans, increasing, accelerating inequality in wages and inequality in wealth. That is legislation by and for the powerful, not we the people. And then we saw the theft of a Supreme Court seat, done directly to maintain a court case called Citizens United that allows the wealthiest Americans to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to drown out the voice of the people here in our democratic republic. That is government by and for the powerful and the privileged instead of the people. Wouldn't it be amazing if this chamber actually believed in this Constitution, this vision of distributed power among the voting citizens, so we will have, as Jefferson said, laws that reflect the will of the people? Well, here we are today with another issue that is a battle between the vision of our Constitution and government by and for the powerful. It's called net neutrality. And what is net neutrality? Well, it's making the internet a place where we can all participate on an equal foundation. The freedom to have a full right to participate in the information world of today and tomorrow. a full opportunity to participate on a level playing field in the economic battleground of today and tomorrow. Freedom. That's what net neutrality is about. This is what the Federal Communications Commission wants. It wants to have a fast lane for the rich and powerful. And it wants to have a slow lane where you're hardly moving at all for all the rest of us, all of working America, stuck here in a congested internet while they sell off the fast lane to the wealthiest. That's what this is about. Now, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, proceeded in its decision to take away equality on the internet, to ignore the technical experts, to produce studies that were debunked by the experts, and to conduct a fraudulent public comment period where bots, robotized comments were filed by the millions, fake comments. They didn't even want America to be able to weigh in legitimately. We said redo the comment period and put up an interface to stop the bots so real people can weigh in. You can have real input from real Americans. That's we, the people government. And the FCC said, no way, because we are bent on our track. And what was their track? To allow discrimination on the internet by the type of user, to allow discrimination on the internet based on the type of business or the type of social content, to allow discrimination on the internet by the type of website, to allow discrimination by the type of platform I use in an iPhone or a desktop, to allow discrimination based on the software application. Is it Safari or is it Google? And why is that? Because the internet service providers can sell, through that license to discriminate, a fast lane to the rich and powerful, while the rest of us are stuck in traffic. It's totally unfair. People in America get it. They understand that this is the opposite of what it means to have government that reflects the will of the people. You know, back if we go to our founders, James Madison said the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty. The advancement and diffusion of knowledge, the guardian of true liberty. But today, a sizable share of the members of the Senate want to shut down advancement and diffusion of knowledge on a level playing field and sell our rights to equality to the highest bidder. They want to put the modern user, the student, the child, the math teacher, the entrepreneur, the small business, they want to lock them in chains and say, we're taking away your freedom to participate in the public square on an equal basis. That is simply wrong. And we know it's wrong because millions of Americans are weighing in. I've had in my office phone calls on some days that are 100 to 1. 1 or 2 or 3 people arguing that, sure, let the powerful sell off our freedom, but for every one of those folks, 100 citizens saying, no way, fight for fairness, fight for equality, fight for our freedom to participate on a level playing field. Oh, we hear it from all kinds of small businesses. More than 6,000 have formally weighed in. We hear it from all kinds of organizations. Back home, I hear it from the realtors. I hear it from the restaurant owners. Everyone who isn't one of the super elite in America wants equal participation and freedom on the internet. But there's a whole host of colleagues today that are considering voting for the elite and rich and powerful over their constituents. I encourage you to rethink your priorities, because we have a responsibility under our Constitution to do government by and for the people, not the powerful. We've heard from chiropractors. We've heard from people who do music venues. We've heard of graphic design artists. We've heard of medical startups. We've heard of everyone across the spectrum saying, give me a fair chance to compete. A fair chance to compete. That is an American value. Let us not trounce that value into the mud today. I anticipate at 3 o'clock, we're going to have a vote on this floor, and a majority of the Senate, a slim majority, is going to fight for freedom. And the rest are going to say, no way, I'm not fighting for the freedom. I'm fighting for the big and powerful people in America. That's just wrong. But then this bill will go to the House. When it goes to the House, there will be another battle. So having won here by a slim margin, a slim bipartisan margin, we have to win in the House, which means that we need American people to weigh in. Because here's the thing, the rich and powerful, they really want to win this fight. Oh, they're going to be spending a lot of money to win this fight. They're going to be sending a lot of lobbyists down the hall to win this fight. So we have to have the people of America weigh in and let them know across the hall, down this road to the House, that as the people's house, they should do the people's business. So let us set the example here in the Senate. Let's not have a slim majority fight for freedom for Americans. Let's have the entire body weigh in with a robust, extensive majority, fighting for freedom on the internet. Let's win this battle today, and let's win it in a few days down the hall. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, yesterday, President Trump joined Republican senators for lunch. He was very optimistic, very positive about a lot of the developments in America's foreign policy in places like North Korea. At the same time, we all recognize that the world continues to be a very dangerous place. National security must be our first responsibility. My goal is a nation that is safe, strong, and secure. Now, to have safety and security at home, we need peace and stability abroad. Republicans in Congress understand that. So does President Trump, and so does Gina Haspel. That's why the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence today approved Gina Haspel's nomination to lead the Central Intelligence Agency. It was a bipartisan vote. You know, that used to be the normal way things operated around here, in a bipartisan way. When you had a nominee who was undeniably qualified, they got support from both sides of the aisle. It's become very uncommon over the past year. Democrats have decided to obstruct President Trump's nominees for important jobs almost at any cost. Well, Gina Haspel got this rare bipartisan approval from the committee for the right reasons, because she is the right person for this job. Now we'll have a vote on the Senate floor. You know, this should be one of the easiest votes for members of the Senate to cast all year. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency is a very important member of the President's national security team. She's the right person for the job. She's been a career intelligence officer for 33 years. That goes back to the days of the Ronald Reagan administration. She actually got interested in the CIA when she learned that women could serve there doing clandestine work all around the world. She served in Africa, in Russia, in Central Europe, in Asia, and she's held top jobs at the agency's headquarters. She understands every element of the work of America's intelligence community. Since she is actually the acting head of the agency today, I think anyone would be hard-pressed to say that she's not up to the job, because she is doing the job. She has the faith and the trust of the men and women in the field who keep us safe every day. Let's not forget that she's also worked very closely with Mike Pompeo. He was head of the CIA, now he's Secretary of State. Having two people in these important jobs who already have a solid, respectful working relationship is extremely important for making sure that the United States foreign policy is airtight. No one else that the President could have nominated who would have been able to work as closely with Secretary of State Pompeo. She's an expert on terrorism. She's an intelligence expert. She's a national security expert. She began her work at the CIA during the Cold War. So she has a deep understanding of Russia and a deep understanding of our challenges there. Look, I think it's clear that Gina Haspel is an absolute star nominee for this vitally important job. And I'm not the only one saying so. The list of people who have come out and endorsed her nomination goes on and on. At least six former leaders of the Central Intelligence Agency have all come out publicly to praise her qualifications and her abilities. CIA directors under President Obama, under President Bush, under President Clinton, Republicans and Democrats alike all agree she's the right person for this job. Look at what they've had to say. Michael Hayden was director under President Bush. He wrote, "Gina Haspel is the person America needs at the CIA." He said she is someone you want in the room when big decisions are being made. Or look what Leon Panetta said, who had the job under President Obama. He said that he was glad that she would be the first woman to head the agency because he said, frankly, she's someone who really knows the CIA inside out. Look at John Brennan. He also ran the agency for President Obama. He said in an interview that she has the experience, the breadth, and the depth on intelligence issues and foreign policy issues over many, many years. You know, it's clear that this is someone who is very highly regarded by people who know her, people who worked with her, and people who have relied on her judgment and her expertise. That expertise and that clear-eyed judgment is more important today than perhaps at any other time since the end of the Cold War. Our nation's adversaries are cunning, they are opportunistic, and they are aggressive. We face challenges in dealing with Syria, dealing with ISIS. We have a lot of work ahead of us in Iran. Next month, President Trump will be meeting with North Korea to try to end their nuclear program. Now, I remain skeptical about North Korea, and so do a lot of Republicans in the Senate. But this is the best opportunity we have ever had to try to get nuclear weapons out of North Korea. The president needs his full team in place. This isn't a simple political game for Democrats to play for TV cameras. This is about peace and security of the world and safety and strength for the United States. As a CIA officer for more than 30 years, Gina Haspel has had to make tough decisions to keep our country safe. The decision we face to confirm her nomination to be director of the Central Intelligence Agency is not a tough decision at all. I will vote loud and clear in support of her nomination, and when she's confirmed, all Americans will be able to sleep soundly knowing that she is on the job providing the security that we all need. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to thank you and thank all of my colleagues here today. This has been a very important debate to have on the floor of the United States Senate. It's a debate over whether or not we are going to continue to have a free and open internet. This vote is a test of the United States Senate, and the American people are watching very closely. This vote is about small businesses, librarians, school teachers, innovators, social advocates, YouTubers, college students, and millions of other Americans who have spoken with one voice to say access to the internet is our right, and we will not sit idly by while this administration stomps on that right. This vote is our moment to show our constituents that the United States Senate can break through the partisanship and break past the powerful outside influences to do the right thing. The right thing for our economy, the right thing for our democracy, the right thing for our consumers, and the right thing for our future. This is common sense to Americans around the country, with the only exception being telecom lobbyists and lawyers inside the Beltway. How do I know? Because 86% of all Americans in polling agree that net neutrality should stay on the books as the law of the United States. The public is telling us loud and clear to vote for this resolution. They're telling us that they don't trust their internet service provider to show up on time for a customer service appointment at their house, so they certainly don't trust them to put consumers ahead of profits. They're telling us that once they pay their internet bill, they expect fair access to the internet. They're telling us that they are sick of the special interests getting their way while the rest of us get the short end of the stick. So I ask each and every one of my colleagues today to heed the calls of the American people, to keep the internet open, to keep the principle of non-discrimination at the heart of what the internet has been and must continue to be, not just for the most powerful voices, but for those that are the smallest voices inside of our society. And that includes entrepreneurs who just last year received half of all venture capital in the United States, which went to software and internet startups. That is what we need. We need to understand how this incredibly chaotic entrepreneurial system in our country works. And at the heart of it is net neutrality. I had, just 2 weeks ago, up in Massachusetts, a meeting with 500 people on net neutrality. I invited Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee was selected by Time magazine as one of the 20 greatest thinkers, scientists, innovators of the 20th century. Who else was on the list with him? Sigmund Freud, Edison, Henry Ford, Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, the organizing principle of the web. And what he said was that the principles of non-discrimination are baked into the internet. It was his intent to have it work that way, so that there could be no discrimination. That is what we are talking about here, a fundamental change which the largest companies now want to implement in order for them to ensure that competitors cannot compete as well as they could if they could not be discriminated against, that consumers have the protections which they need so that they are not harmed, so that this innovation economy can continue to unleash itself for the benefit of the United States, so that we are number one, looking over our shoulders at number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the world. The internet and its success is a story about the United States being number one, not any individual company, and certainly not a small handful of broadband companies. That is why the rest of the world envies what we have in our country, this incredible engine of innovation, which has created millions of new jobs since the 1996 Telecommunications Act was passed, since this digital revolution was unleashed. We must keep these principles intact. That is what we are debating here today on the floor of the United States Senate. We are debating, in essence, what the principles should be for this organizing principle of our country for the 21st century, which is the internet. And from my perspective, the only way in which every American, every entrepreneur, every new idea is going to have a shot at helping to make our country better is if net neutrality stays on the books. So this is a defining vote, the most important vote that we're going to have in this generation on the internet. The whole country is watching. 86% of all voters support net neutrality. 82% of all Republicans support net neutrality. If it's not broke, don't fix it. It's working. And it works for the smallest voices and for the largest voices. And what these huge internet companies, the internet service providers want to do is change the rules, tilt the playing field. Well, it was a long route to get to this era. We had one telephone company, one cable company, monopolies going into people's homes. It took a lot to get away from that era so that smaller voices, newer voices could be heard. And when that happened, it unleashed trillions of dollars of private sector investment that these software and internet companies, these innovators, were now able to gain access to. They could have done it if the rules had made it possible before we changed the laws in the 1990s. But since then, they have. And they've reinvented. They have reinvented not just the United States of America, but they have reinvented the whole world. And there's a vocabulary which has been created since 1996. Words that now everyone thinks are common. Google, Amazon, eBay, Hulu, YouTube. They didn't exist. They didn't have a role in our society. We had to change the rules in order to make it possible for them. And there's a whole new generation of companies whose names we do not know yet, but because of net neutrality, they will be known. They will be the job creators for the next several decades in our country. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I thank all of the members who participated in this debate. There won't be a more important one that we have, because it goes right to the heart of our identity as a free and open society. So I urge my fellow senators to vote yes on my Congressional Review Act resolution to restore the net neutrality rules to the books. And, Mr. President, I yield back the balance of my time.
Hey, everybody, we're coming up on the expected time for the vote. Senator Markey has just spoken in favor of net neutrality and the resolution that he's offering today. And we are hopeful that all of the efforts of the past several months are going to pay off with a vote on behalf of the full Senate to advance this measure of congressional disapproval targeting the FCC's move to end net neutrality as we understand it. So what will happen after this is if this passes, then it will go to the House where it's got to be approved by the full House. But this is definitely the first step in stopping Ajit Pai and Donald Trump from destroying net neutrality and further entrenching corporate control of our public spaces and public debate. We will see, if this fails, we will see in June the actual start date of the new version of the internet as dominated by these ISPs that will be unrestricted by net neutrality regulations. So if you haven't called your senator, it's still not too late to do it. You've got a few minutes left before we anticipate a vote coming up. It's really important that you call, tweet, post on Facebook, post on Snapchat, really drive home the message that there is no public debate out in the main part of the country outside of Washington, D.C. I mean, 63% of Americans support basic net neutrality principles. 80% of people over 55 plus support net neutrality. You can see these graphics that we've got from Mozilla going across the screen. I mean, 91% of people say that Americans should be able to freely and quickly access their preferred content on the internet, and that 76% of all Americans, including 81% of Democrats and 73% of Republicans, support net neutrality. The debate's over out in the country. It's just a matter of whether public opinion still matters in a Congress that is soaked in internet service provider money from places like AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast. They're spending hundreds of millions and billions of dollars every year, either fighting for the campaign finance laws they want, fighting to pick and choose which representatives we have, fighting to pick and choose what actually makes it to the floor in Congress through their lobbying budgets. We can stop them with enough people power, but it requires you doing things like getting on the phone right now and calling your member of Congress and your senator. Go to battleforthenet.com and you can find a contact tool at the bottom of the page that will help you get in touch with your elected officials right now. So I'm going to go back just to the main feed. We anticipate a vote soon, but it is not too late right now to take a real step to save net neutrality. So I hope you'll take that opportunity before it passes this afternoon. So hang in there. We're coming up to, I think, the vote, and then we'll see what happens.
Mr. President?
The Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, we're about to vote on this Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval dealing with this issue of net neutrality. And let me say again what I said at the beginning of this discussion earlier today, and that is that I support principles of net neutrality that can be enshrined in law, that actually do address the issues that people on the other side are concerned about, whether that's a ban on blocking of lawful content, ban on throttling of internet speeds, ban on paid prioritization that would create fast lanes and slow lanes and that sort of thing. Those are things on which I think there's pretty broad agreement. And frankly, it seems to me at least that there is bipartisan support for pursuing a legislative solution to this, to put into law, to codify once and for all those principles of an open internet. But instead, we're having this fake argument over a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval, which is going nowhere, and my colleagues on the other side know that, and all it does is just prolong the period of uncertainty that we've been operating in now for some time, where internet service providers are not putting money, investing in new technologies and innovation and infrastructure, instead investing in lawyers and litigation as this cloud of uncertainty hangs over the regulation of the internet. And what our colleagues on the other side are proposing is simply this, that is to regulate the internet like a public utility in the same way that Ma Bell was regulated back in the 1930s, because the law that they would use to regulate the internet is Title II of the 1934 Communications Act. And so basically what we're saying is we want to take a law that's 80 years old and use it to regulate a 21st century innovation like the internet. The internet which exploded under the light touch regime that was in place up until 2015. So in 2015, the FCC decided that they wanted to use the heavy hand of government regulation as opposed to the light touch. And so what this FCC has said simply is that we're going to go back to the light touch of regulation that was in place for the first 2 decades of its existence, and 2 decades that led to explosive growth, dramatic increases in productivity, economic opportunity for Americans all over the country. And so here we are today talking about a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval that would roll back that FCC's decision and an attempt to restore and put back in place the heavy-handed regulation of Title II under the 1934 Communications Act. So I think, frankly, that we can solve this issue quite simply, and that is to sit down in a bipartisan way, figure out a way to put those, enshrine in law, those principles of an open internet that would ban the things that I just talked about, ban blocking, ban throttling, ban paid prioritization, but do it in a way that doesn't draw on the Title II authority that essentially gives the FCC the authority, if they want to regulate rates. I mean, this is a heavy-handed government approach to regulating the most powerful economic engine that we've seen literally in generations. And so I think that the clear vote here today is in favor of legislation that would put those, put those rules into effect, and against a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval, which is simply an attempt to, I guess, gain partisan advantage, you know, with an issue that people seem to think will be useful in the upcoming elections. But honestly, it's not going anywhere. We all know that. And I think the sooner we conclude that, the sooner we get serious about sitting down together across from each other and actually putting into law these principles in open internet, the better off we're all going to be. Now, I mentioned this earlier today. There are a number of our colleagues who have made statements publicly as recently as yesterday at a subcommittee hearing, Commerce Subcommittee hearing, where they supported that approach of bipartisan legislation. I've had colleagues on the other side who have made public statements, and I quoted some of them today, in support of a legislative solution and along the lines of what I'm proposing here. And of course, we've had multiple examples of misstatements and hyped up statements that aren't grounded in any sense of reality, so much so that even the Washington Post fact checker came out and said the statements that were being made by the Democrats warranted three Pinocchios. Three Pinocchios. The LA Times editorial just this last week editorialized, and I quote, "Rather than jousting over a resolution of disapproval, Congress needs to put this issue to bed once and for all by crafting a bipartisan deal giving the Commission limited but clear authority to regulate broadband providers and to preserve net neutrality." That's the way to do this, Mr. President. It's not to have an FCC that bounces back and forth from administration to administration at the whim of whatever the political winds of the day are, or perhaps even worse yet, spending a lot of time in court litigating this issue, millions and millions and millions of dollars that could be spent investing in innovation and new technology and new infrastructure that could deliver higher, faster speeds, higher quality of services to people across this country, and including those in rural areas who frankly have missed out on a lot of this. And you're not going to get broadband providers to deliver services or invest in rural areas if they're operating under a cloud of uncertainty, which is what this CRA, if it were successful, would ultimately lead to. So I would simply ask our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to reject this ill-fated and frankly, just charade of an exercise that we're going through here in exchange for a true discussion, bipartisan legislation. I mentioned earlier I have a draft, 2015, that we put together, and I've had numerous opportunities to discuss that draft with members on the other side. We've socialized some of these issues. We've shopped them around. Certainly isn't the end-all product, but that's what legislation is about. It's about the opportunity to sit down, take input from both sides, come up with a bipartisan solution, and I think that's certainly in our reach here if we're just willing to do it. But this is not the way to do it. This is a dead-end canyon which does nothing to solve the issue, and all it does is perhaps whip up some people who, you know, are perhaps interested in trying to use this as a political wedge issue, but it's not going to do anything to solve the problem. So I would urge my colleagues to reject and vote no on this resolution of disapproval, and let's get serious about legislating. Mr. President, I would yield back the balance of our time.
All time has been yielded back. The clerk will read the title of the joint resolution for the third time.
So
Calendar
folks,
number 406,
we're coming up on the vote here.
SJ Res 52, joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code, and so forth.
The question is on passage of the joint resolution. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy.
Folks, what's happening right now is we're seeing the final vote on SJ Res 52, which is a resolution that would express congressional disapproval for Ajit Pai's FCC's regulatory decision to gut net neutrality. If this vote succeeds, it will proceed to the House, and we'll have a chance for a vote there as well to stop the Trump administration from gutting net neutrality. So we've got about 9 minutes left in the vote here, and if you haven't contacted your senator, this would be your last chance to do so before the final roll call vote is completed. So please use the tools at battleforthenet.com to keep those calls coming in, and we'll just keep streaming here and keep you updated on the final outcome. So thanks for watching so far. We're going to just go back to the main stream now.
Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Resch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Collins, Duckworth, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Markey, Menendez, Murray, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Smith, Warner, Warren. Ms. Klobuchar, Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Daines, Ernst, Flake, Graham, Hyde-Smith, Isaacson, Lee, Roberts, Rounds, Sullivan, Thune, Toomey. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Ms. Fisher, Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Udall, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mrs. Capito, no. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Gardner, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Hatch, no. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Young, Mr. Young, no.
The yeas are 52, the nays are 47. The joint resolution is passed.
Folks, that was amazing. I don't know if you just saw what just happened, but the Senate just voted to approve this bill that will override the net neutrality provisions that the Trump administration is pushing. We are able to move forward to fight for net neutrality in the House. So this bill was the result of a big push by Senator Markey and allied folks, both in the Senate and outside groups like Demand Progress and Fight for the Future and a number of other groups. It's extraordinarily exciting. I'm kind of giddy. It's rare that we get a win these days, so apologize for my huge grin right now, but this is amazing. So the next step in the fight will be this bill will go to the House. If it passes the House, we have another real chance to fix net neutrality before the FCC can gut it. This means that we live to fight another day, and that there's a real chance here to win against corporate power. So stay tuned. I'm going to go live on our Facebook feed in just a moment at facebook.com/Derek Crowe, which is DERRICKCROWE, and we're going to talk about it for a little bit about what this means. So congratulations to everyone who fought so hard on this, and let's get to the next step. Thanks so much.